Hi, and welcome to Midas Investing. Today we're going to be taking a look at 10K filings or annual reports. This video is something I've been meaning to do for a while, in that it's not a specific valuation of a specific company, but more of a brief overview and guide to annual reports and what type of information you can find at what points within them and how they're useful for putting together your own valuations. This type of video has been requested of me a lot, and I've been meaning to get around to it for some time. And I will say that right off the bat, for some people, this will probably seem massively like review. And for other people, they may even get a little bit lost in some of the things I'm going into here. I'm trying to fly a little bit of a line through the middle in terms of how knowledgeable some people are on these documents. And also right off the bat, I want to make it clear that while annual reports and 10K files are often very similar and have a lot of overlap, there is a lot of differences between them. And also, especially if you go to international companies where they have different filing rules, you'll find a lot of differences there, which I'll try to comment on some of those differences. But nonetheless, we're basically just going to be going over one annual report today and using that as our template for the overall structure of annual reports generally. Please like the video. It's the best way you can help us with the YouTube algorithm, and subscribe to the channel if you've not already. Also, consider joining our free Discord. The link is in the description below. So now here we are at the actual annual report for Apple, as we were talking about. And as I had said at the start, this is just one company's annual report. They're not exactly the same as every other company. Every company's annual report is different, and every company's annual report is the same. And after you've looked at a couple hundred annual reports from a couple hundred different companies, you'll know exactly what I mean by that. It's like they really are basically all the same, but all unique in their own ways simultaneously. So now we're actually going to go through the annual report section by section, giving a brief overview of the kind of main sections, the type of information that you can get within each of those sections, and how useful I find each of the sections in terms of like for your valuation right off the bat. So scrolling down here, I will comment a little bit on this very first page that it has right here, since this very first page is very similar for a lot of other companies. It does include a lot of pretty basic level information about the company, including literally its address, details relating to the different filings it has in terms of the securities, whether it's common stock as well as the different type of bond issuance that they've done. It also often has a little section down here where it actually gives you the amount of shares outstanding as of the date of the filing. And implicit within that is also it gives you information about when their fiscal year ends, which is something that is often something you might want to pay attention to right before you hop into a company. And if we scroll down a little bit, the very first thing that the vast majority of annual reports have is then a table of contents, a little guide for what you can find within the document. We don't necessarily need to go through all of these things, but it is very, very useful, the fact that a lot of these are here, because it gives you an idea of what pages you can find the various information on. Because while a lot of annual reports are structured very similarly with certain things in certain orders, though there is a lot of variation within that as well, there is still a pretty general structure that I kind of wanted to comment on right off the bat, because it kind of might help you get your bearings within the annual report itself. The thing that most people are aware of is within an annual report, that whether they've been looking through 10K filings themselves or not, maybe they just tend to look at a lot of financial information off of data services, is that they know that the financial statements themselves are within the report somewhere within. And typically speaking, they're somewhere near the middle of the document. It may not literally be near the middle of the pages of the document, but effectively, in terms of like the amount of content within the document, it is typically near the middle. Here in this document, it claims to be at page 28. And so that's one thing I kind of wanted to comment right off the bat. A lot of these table of contents are in fact clickable. So I click that and it'll take me down to the table of contents for the financial statements themselves, which some of them don't have this extra table of contents. But if you scroll just a little bit further, then you have the actual financial statements. Here's the income statement, followed by the comprehensive income statement, then the balance sheet. Many companies often have the balance sheet listed first before the income statement, but just to show you how there's lots of variation there. And then there's the statement of shareholders' equity, followed by the statement of cash flows. Those five financial statements making up basically the key statements that you'll typically find in all financial statements. So we jumped down here immediately to the middle of the document to kind of just show you that. But the reason why I wanted to do this right off the bat is to show you that, like I said, it's like if you don't really know the company very well, you can kind of generally know that halfway through this document somewhere, there's going to be a financial statements. And when you're unfamiliar with the company and you're just trying to kind of get a quick bearing on the company, it's actually pretty easy to just scroll down and kind of look for the section that has those financial statements. They kind of stand out a little bit. They're the ones that have more numbers in columns and rows like right off the bat like this, unless it's a very, very complicated company, maybe like a finance company, a bank of some sort with lots of like securities and stuff. They might have way more tables within their financial report. But the point is typically speaking, from a literally just a visual perspective, watching the information scroll past you, the statements themselves kind of stand out as being more numbers. Like there's just a lot more numbers to them than the rest of the document. So you can kind of, if you're just trying to quickly find this part of the document, it's actually not that hard to just scroll down and find it, is kind of basically the point I'm trying to say. And that's useful because, like I said, then you sort of know what's probably above you and what's probably below you. So now we will actually scroll all the way back up to the top to kind of cover the idea of like what type of information is usually before the financial statements. So if we then scroll past the table of contents down a little bit lower, we come to this part one, business, where it starts talking about the actual business of the company. Here for Apple, it then breaks down into the types of products they sell, the iPhones, Macs, iPods, wearables, stuff like that. Then it goes into the services. Not all companies have services. Not all companies have products. Some have both. But here it'll then break down and try to give as much information as they're willing to give about each individual product, service, or segment of products and services, depending on how they see it. You very often then find, following up on just the categorization of the types of products and services they sell, some information related to how they do their actual selling, whether it's through large amounts of advertisements, distribution networks, different relationships possibly that they have with other companies for the distribution. You might find some of that information here, like markets and distributions they have here. Then in this particular one, they have a little bit about competition that often includes some very useful information. And they can often have different categories as well. Here we have another one detailing information about the research and development they do, the supply of the components they do, the intellectual property that they develop, the business seasonality even they have a little section here on. Human capital. This is a section you often very much see, which it was something where you'll very much often find the amount of employees they have. They might even tell you different categories of employees. They might say we have this many of R&D people and this many of administrative people, depending on the company. Like I said, they might also even give you some information about their compensation, depending on this. They might also give you some information about their diversity, whether that matters to you or not. But so as you can see, like I said, there's just underneath this general first section where it describes the business and basically how they administer the business in broad overview. A lot of it being text. I highly recommend you read this section for every company, but for many companies, if you're just trying to get a quick view of some of the numbers, this is not necessarily the section you want to waste a lot of time on if you're just trying to go quickly through information about a company. But if you're really trying to like get in there and understand the company from a finer level, this is definitely a good place to really, really read carefully. And it might include some very, very useful information for the valuation, depending on the company as well, including, for example, like I said, in the competition section, they might include some market share information. In the different products and services categories, they might possibly include some unit levels depending on the year. It's also possible that in the markets and distribution, they could mention some information that is relevant to your margins for different products as well. And you can kind of scan through these paragraphs, and anytime you see a number, you might want to focus in on it and be like, is that number potentially useful to me? You could do basically things like that. So coming down further, then the next section you often see is this risk factors section. This section is anywhere from kind of moderate in length to actually relatively long, depending on the company, depending on the industry. So what is included in this? Pretty much everything. As I said, they call it the risk factor section. So this is the part of the document where they list pretty much everything that they can think of that could possibly be a risk to the company, which basically means everything. So this is almost the section of the document where the lawyers run wild and are basically like, how can we put down basically any possible piece of information that makes sure that they aren't going to yell at us later for not telling them. And so like in that sense, you can kind of understand like how my comments around it, where I say it's like a lot of this information isn't going to be very useful at all, but there might be one or two tiny little pieces of information that are critical to your understanding of the company. And because it's risks. So that's the thing. It's like they might include some information about a company that they work with, a partner of theirs. It might be a supplier of theirs. It might be information about their customers. It could be about customer concentration levels. It could be, as like right here in front of us, we have macroeconomic and industry risks. They might be telling you how sensitive they are to interest rates or to commodity prices, or even to the geopolitical risks of a specific country in which they operate or sell to. It could be things like that. It could be something related to their labor relations. Maybe they have a high amount of unionized workers, and that's something that is beneficial to you or negative to you for one reason or another. It could be information about their CEO. Maybe their CEO has some debts that are of some concern to the shareholders. Maybe they have some conflicts of interest that they have to mention here in some way or shape or form. As I said, for the vast majority of companies, probably 95% of this section is just kind of boilerplate lawyer speak that is mostly the same. Like a lot of these companies list a lot of the same stuff in these sections. But as I said, there's usually one or two very company specific or even just industry specific pieces of information that is super, super important to understand. So while I agree that is a section of the document that'll really, really make your eyes glaze over in boredom, you should try to make sure you've at least read through it a little bit. Like I said, at least sort of skim read it to make sure that there's no words in there that catch your attention that are super, super important. At least something like that. But it is a highly ignored section of the document that I think a lot of people end up ignoring to their own detriment. All right, then coming down a little bit further, the next section that they have here for Apple, though this section is one of the ones that sometimes jumps around, and I've even seen some companies that don't really include too much in this section. There's usually a little bit of a section somewhere in here before the financial statements about kind of the stock itself a little bit. They'll have a little bit of a section talking about the actual common equity. They'll tell you what ticker it trades under, what market it's on, how many shareholders of record they have, though shareholders of record doesn't really represent all of the actual shareholders because of representation holding, but that's neither here nor there. Then they might even include some information like this table right here, which tells us information about the stock repurchases they've done in the most recent quarter. They even give the average prices paid in each quarter, so which is very, very useful information for some people that want to track the effectiveness of share repurchases for a company. But then you'll often find also this a graph of some sort, a graph showing the performance of the company relative to the S&P 500, maybe another sector index that's relevant to them, possibly even a more subsector industry-based index of comparable companies that they compare themselves with, for better or worse, comparing the performance of the stock for the last several years compared to their peers. This is kind of interesting in my opinion, because if you're ever trying to find comparables for a company for one reason or another, if you're unsure about like what companies that you could theoretically compare your company to, this is a good place to start, I think, in terms of trying to figure out what you could compare them to. It's like this is effectively them telling you what they think their comparables are. It's like Apple themselves right here, I would say, is essentially arguing that whatever is included in the Dow Jones US Technology Super Sector Index, they are essentially saying that that's a reasonably comparable index to compare with them. Now, I'm willing to bet that that index includes a lot of pretty wildly varying companies, but the point is that's an index that the company themselves chose to compare themselves to. So that's at least a starting point if you're trying to think about comparables. All right, now coming down to this next section, the management discussion and analysis of financial conditions. This section right here, the management discussion section, is one of the most important sections of the 10K. Pretty much after the financial statements, this is the next most important section that I would say, like if you're literally just gonna ignore everything in the 10K, you're just gonna look at the financial statements, then if you're gonna do one other thing, it should probably be to read the management discussion and analysis section. MD&A, for example, is what it is often called. You'll see that acronym MD&A, Management Discussion and Analysis. Now, I do often see this one listed before the financial statements, like we have it here in this particular document. I've also seen it listed after the financial statement. So this is a section that does jump around a little bit depending on the company, depending on how and where they're filing, but they all include this section somewhere. So that's the point, is like it's definitely in there somewhere. And the reason why it's useful is because, as it implies, this is the management actually sharing some of their thoughts about the performance of the company. It's usually covering this year and the last most recent fiscal year for the company as well. So it's a comparison over the course of a 2-year period, giving in a list of the events that happen with the company, significant events that have affected their business and operations, things that they're planning for the upcoming year as well. And then oftentimes it breaks down details related to those segments in ways that maybe weren't even in that business section that we were talking about a little bit before, or in some of the other sections that we haven't even talked about yet. But like here, for example, it shows they have it literally quarter by quarter in 2022, giving us a rundown of basically the achievements the company has within each of those quarters. And so you could compare that, for example, with like quarterly information about the revenues and the margins within those quarters to maybe say, how did each of these events perhaps affect all of those events over the course of the year? They might include other information, like here, for example, they're talking about COVID. And then down here, they also started talking about breaking things down by products and services by the different categories. As I said, different companies do this differently. Some companies have more text-based discussion in this section and not necessarily a whole bunch of tables. Other companies might include a bunch of tables of information like this and instead have those tables somewhere up, like maybe near that business section near the top. And some companies in general, honestly, just don't give you a whole lot of tables of numbers necessarily. And whereas other ones give you a lot. So it's like the actual types of information that are given to you in numeric form versus just talking form in text form is a little bit different. Kind of depends on the company, but nonetheless, you might often find some very, very useful information to put into a model in this section as well. But like I said, it's like a lot of it has to do with getting a kind of a grasp of like what the management actually thinks is important with the company. Like they're essentially telling you what they think is important in this section. So it's very, very useful in that sense. Here, they're also breaking it down, the segment operations by geography, which sometimes, like I said, you see that up in this section here, or maybe up in the business section, but usually I expect to find geographic information a little bit further down in the document, because we haven't really gotten to that part of the discussion yet, but that's something you find often as well. Here they're talking more about their margins, operating expenses, other expenses broken down into like by category. This is another set of type of things that you often might see up closer in that business section near the top, but here in the management discussion section, that works out pretty well as well. All right, and now we're back down at the financial statements. I kind of already gave a brief, at least mapping of what the financial statements are and that they're here. And as I've said at the start, this is like probably the information about the annual report that most people already know about a little bit, which is at least just like these documents, what they are, what they include, and stuff like that. So I'm not. This isn't a guide to financial statements. This is a guide to annual reports. So I'm not actually going to get into the nitty gritty of how financial statements work. I've talked a little bit about that in other places, but I would maybe have to talk in a higher detail about that somewhere else. But then the next section below the financial statements, which is a very large section, but essentially it's the last chunk of the financial statement. As I was kind of saying before, there's sort of like the before financial statements, then there's the financial statements, and then the sort of the after financial statements. Well, the after financial statements section, if for the most part, for most companies, is just essentially the notes, essentially just the notes section. Now, what are they the notes to? They're the notes to the financial statements. If you actually look at the financial statements one by one, there often is a little bit these little number marks next to each little category, though on Apple's document they actually don't have numbers listed next to these, but oftentimes you'll see like a number in a parentheses next to one of these lines, giving you a hint for each of these, essentially which note you would have to go down to find more information about that particular line item. Like for example, if we looked up here on the balance sheet, it has accounts receivable right here. And if we just imagine that it had like in a parentheses, a little number right there, maybe a note 4 or whatever. I'm not sure what the actual note is. We'll find out in a second. But so imagine there was a parentheses 4 right there. That would tell me that I could come down to the note section, find note number 4, and that it would tell me more information about their accounts receivable. In this particular company, the actual note for that is, well, right here, there's the accounts receivable listed under note 3. It's a subsection of note 3. So like then I could read through here. It would give me more information about how the receivables work. It might even break down the receivables into different categories. It might tell me even some risks related to the receivables, like for example, how one particular customer might account for a really large percentage of them or something like that. Different pieces of information like that. But nonetheless, like I said, if starting after the section, the first note where it's basically just changes in accounting rules and stuff like that, it then very often starts off with a segment category or a revenue section. Sometimes you'll see the segmenting much further down in the notes. Sometimes it's relatively higher in the notes. The order of these notes changes depending on the company, but there will very, very typically be a revenue section of at some point or another, which will include all of it listed off by the different products and services and by category. It might also do it by geography, depending on the company and how they choose to set it up. But a lot of the nitty gritty information that you need when trying to build up a revenue based model for the company, you'll find in the revenue note. So that's why I'm specifically trying to call out the revenue note, because that's going to be one that's very useful. So like I said, sometimes it's more of a geographic distribution note or something like that, and it might be a much lower in the note section. It might not be note number 2, it might be note number 11 or something like that. But then scrolling down even further, we got financial instruments that's including both their cash as well as all their securities, as well as anything else that requires some sort of financial valuation as an asset. And then they tell you the different methods by which how they determine the value of those assets. The other categories, as we were talking about, like accounts receivables that they might break down, property, plant, and equipment. They might want to tell you whether how much of it is land, how much of it is machinery, how much of it is other stuff, and how much of it is accumulated depreciation. Other categories such as other income and expenses, breaking down in things into interest income versus interest expense, which is very useful if you're trying to get really, really precise on like what their interest rates are for their debt and things like that. They also tend to have a section on income taxes where they break things down into current versus deferred taxes. Also, very often, federal versus state, or even federal versus foreign categorizations for taxes, which if you're really trying to be very precise on what money they're earning where and what type of tax rates get what, then this is very, very useful information for you there. Then they might include other things about like the deferred tax assets and liabilities, which might tell you information on whether they have, for example, net operating losses that they could carry forward on their future earnings, stuff like that. If it's like a young growth company, this is very, very useful information for your model. Uncertain tax positions, maybe they have assets or earnings being held overseas that they have might have to pay taxes on if they're trying to repatriate it. That could be useful information for you as well. They'll often then have a note or notes somewhere down in here talking about their debts. Now, I'm bringing that up here at note number 6, where they bring up leases, because sometimes leases are listed before debt, but leases effectively are debt. And so if they're listed in 2 different notes, that just means you have 2 different notes to read in order to keep track of all their debts. But reading into the lease section is usually how you're going to be able to determine how those leases actually are like debt by the fact that they'll usually tell you the term of the leases. They'll usually give you information about the implied interest rates being calculated therein. They'll give you information about the maturities of that too. So if you have a company with a bunch of debt, well, you can determine just how much risk that it's going to be to the company over the next year or two by determining just how much of the actual debt that they're going to have to roll over or pay down in order to keep operating their business. Now, like I said, we're talking about that in terms of the lease liabilities right here. But I bet, yep, look at that. We scroll down a little bit further, and the very next note is the debt. So you can see exactly what I was talking about. Tells you the interest rates, tells you the maturities, and stuff like that. Here's a schedule of the principal payments on the maturities and stuff like that. Then they have a section on shareholders' equity. Now, we already talked about one section where they talked about repurchases a little bit, but sometimes you'll see some of that information listed in this section here because shareholder repurchases is very often a part of the equity statement as well. This is also where you can find out just how many shares that they have outstanding on their current repurchase program, if that is a thing that they have. But then that can give you very precise information about what the numbers of shares were at the start of the year as well as at the end of the year. They then often will give you information related to employee stock plans, executive stock plans, options, stuff like that, restricted stock units, 401k plans, all of these things, everything related to equity. You will find some of that information related here. So if you're trying to say come up with a very, very precise calculation for the diluted share count, this is the section that you work in. Then coming down even further, we have a section here in note 10 called commitments and contingencies. Now, this section, depending on the company, could be very, very important, or it could be kind of a nothing burger. This is another section where you should probably at least double check it a little bit to see what's included here. But for a lot of companies, it's not going to be the most important section in the world. What commitments and contingencies can include is it can include purchase obligations with some of their suppliers or their other business partners. They might have made contractual commitments to essentially supply revenue to companies over the course of certain years at certain pre-agreed prices and arrangements, which they can often get out of at a cost. So the point is this is essentially the agreements as they currently stand. And it's not that they necessarily have to make these purchases, but there might be more costs associated with trying to break off of them. So the point is, as things currently stand, these are the types of expenses that the company says that they can know for a fact are going to happen in the future. And that's just obligations. Then there's also this concept of contingencies, which is to say that the company might often know that there's a potential for something that they could have to pay a large sum of money at some point in the future if something bad happens. And it could be the other way around, technically. It could be a potential that they could earn a large sum of money without them really having too much control over how or why that happens.
The most common example of things to include in this category, for better or worse, is lawsuits. The company might know that they're involved in a lawsuit. They might believe that it's pretty remote, that there's actually going to be a negative ruling against them, but they might still want to mention that there is a lawsuit and that that is technically a possibility for them. And the contingency section is the section in which they'll likely mention that. Now, the next section down here is segment information and geographic data. Now, as I had kind of already mentioned in that revenue note, they already included a lot of segment information. And I had said that very often, or one or the other, an annual report will have a section much lower about geographic information. Here showing that Apple actually has basically both. So here we have more information for the segments broken down of the different sales by the different categories, but here it's a little bit more of a focus on the geography of the company. They actually include a lot of information here. Apple does. A lot of companies' geographic information is a little bit more simple than this, in the sense that here they're showing both net sales and operating income by all these different geographies, which is pretty neat, including the net sales, but also including even the locations of the long-lived assets. If you're trying to figure out where the assets are of the company, this is one thing, one section that you can find for that. And then here they also include a little bit more information related to the subcategorization of their expenses within the operating income, which is also pretty interesting type of information that they don't necessarily have to include. So yeah, not all companies include a whole page worth of information for this particular section. Other companies include very, very little, but this is often a section with lots of useful information for what you're looking at. All right, and now down past that, we get to the next section here, which is essentially the end of the document. Now you may say, wow, really the end of the document? Isn't there so much more to talk about? Actually, it's like, yeah, there's a lot more to the document. If you'll keep scrolling, you'll see there's actually a lot more pages, but that's basically the end of the section that really matters to us. Now you may say, how do you know? How do you know that you've reached the end of the document? Well, you'll find this section down here where it has listed different sub exhibit numbers of all the different files that are actually included in the total filing that's put forward to the SEC. So like once you see this section where they're kind of just referencing a bunch of other stuff and other documents and other legalese, that's kind of the part where you know you've reached the end of the document. And then past that, for example, then they also include the section where all the signatures is. That's also how you know you've essentially reached the end of the document. But there is very often more pages after that, which is mostly just related to legalese, stuff related to your accounting firm. It might include some details related to one of these other documents. Like for example, down here, this particular one includes some more random stuff related to the common stock and voting rights and stuff like that, which I mean, feel free to look through it if you want. But like I said, that's kind of the end of what I would call the actual annual report. And at that point, it's kind of getting into a different document altogether. So it's not really super important. I will mention, because like I said, this is just the Apple one that we've been looking at. And so they're going to be different than other companies in the way that they present different information. So the last section we had here was this geographic information. One section that Apple did not include here that I very often do see at the bottom of the annual report is some companies, like I said, some companies will include their quarterly financial statements for the year down near the bottom as well. So sometimes if a company chooses to include that, you may actually find the quarterly financial statements listed down there as well, which can be very useful if you're trying to maybe track some seasonality related information or something like that. Please like the video. It's the best way you can help us with the YouTube algorithm, and subscribe to the channel if you've not already. Also, consider joining our free Discord. The link is in the description below. So that's going to do it for this brief overview of 10K filings and annual reports. As I kind of said at the start, it's like there's so much information that you can get out of an annual report, and I tried to make this simultaneously a brief kind of first guide for plenty of people who don't really know much about annual reports. Can kind of like learn quite a lot even if you don't really know much about them at all. But at the same time, I wanted to try to get a somewhat detailed approach of saying like what really isn't all included in here and the types of information you get into. So as I had said at the start, this was probably a review for a lot of you out there, but hopefully some of you out there found this really helpful and really useful. Let me know in the comments, and please like the video if you guys would like to see more type learning to invest type of content like this coming from me in the future. I'll catch you all in the next video. Bye.